Buenos días. De nuevo estamos en el Campus Yuste 2015, en el marco de una de las conferencias y cursos más interesantes que se están organizando en España en este momento, diría yo, y que tiene que ver con la religión en la Europa en el siglo XXI. En este momento voy a tener el placer de presentar a uno de los ponentes de origen senegalés, que ha realizado un largo recorrido hasta convertirse en uno de los artífices de la libertad religiosa en el plano internacional. Yo quisiera explicar lo que significa esto, pero sus palabras van a ser mucho más elocuentes que las mías. Él está al frente de una ONG, Asociación No Gubernamental, que defiende la libertad de religión y creencia. Y son muchos años los que avalan a esta International Religious Liberty Association en el plano internacional, cuya fundadora fue Eleanor Roosevelt, y que tiene a lo largo de la historia europea y americana un largo recorrido. Son muchos los aspectos, las conferencias, los congresos. Tiene un equipo, un think tank, como dicen ellos, tiene un equipo de pensamiento, un equipo de ideas que desarrolla posibilidades de cómo trasladar el mensaje de la libertad, el significado de la libertad de religión y creencia en contextos de posconflicto, en contextos de conflicto. Por lo tanto, yo le voy a dar las gracias en inglés en 2 o 3 palabras, porque sé lo que significa dejar muchos otros temas. Él viene de Londres, de una reunión muy importante de la Christian World Communion, donde tiene un papel relevante como secretario general de la misma y ha tenido la bondad de dedicar parte de su tiempo a nosotros en el día de hoy. Thank you, Ganoune, because we appreciate your coming to Spain, particular to Yuste. We know that you have a lot of engagement and you have a very busy life, I would say. But your message is needed in Europe, and that is why we wanted you to come to Yuste. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Rosa Maria. Thank you for this opportunity to meet new faces. I'm also delighted to see again Jaime, Rosel. We were together in Pepperdine, California recently. So I'm just honored and delighted for this invitation. It is always a joy to meet you, and now a new audience here. I've been, since I was sitting here, very much interested by what you have shared earlier and the previous lecture also. So this is very rich. I'm really delighted for that. I apologize to be speaking in English. Yo quiero hablar español, pero yo no puedo. Yo comprendo mucho, pero yo no hablo bien. Okay. So I'm sorry for that. Maybe next time, so I will learn more in between, and then I'll be able to take a risk. I would like then to address here the issue of the UN. I will be talking about the United Nations. I'll be sharing with the role and function of the NGOs in particular, and then zoom a little bit in on the reasons and rationale for the International Religious Liberty Association, a little focus on religious freedom. So my presentation is in fact divided into 3 sections. I put this on PowerPoint. This way it will be easier as far as the English is concerned. You may be following. So 3 sections. The first one consists in a description of the United Nations. What is it? Its pillars, its values that have drawn an international consensus. Second, I will address the nature, role, and functions of the non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that seem to play a vital role today in securing the fulfillment of the obligations of state actors and agencies. Thirdly, I would like to focus then on one of the universal human rights, one of the fundamental freedoms, the freedom of religion or belief, as we call it at the UN, which of course include the freedom not to believe, not to believe or to belong to any religious institution or philosophical system. Now, I would then maybe highlight some values that really seem to matter and motivate people and nations to work together to make our world a better place. So let me then start immediately with the United Nations. What is it? Before I show you, think about an edifice, a house, supported or sustained by pillars. In the UN, you basically have three major pillars. The first one is peace and security. The second pillar that will sustain the edifice of the UN is justice and development. And then finally, the third pillar is human rights. Now, you may be wondering why the first pillar, peace and security. In the European context in which we are today, you have to understand that the United Nations did not just come out of the blue like that. In fact, you have to remember that there were 2 world wars and devastating a whole generation of Europeans decimated, basically. People in Europe used to spend time waging wars. Now, elsewhere also, but in Europe also, and this got into a climax of this, what was termed total war, devastating. So a lot of people died, and then nations start saying, but maybe instead of waging wars, why not starting to build the peace? So this was really the initial idea for the UN to start saying, okay, instead of wars, I will not take time to go throughout history, the 30-year war, and then, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No need to go through that, but just limiting myself to the First World War, Second World War, and then some countries went through 2 occupations, France, for example. So instead of basically waging wars, the nations decided, let's build peace. Therefore, the first pillar. But very soon they realized you cannot build peace and have security without another component, which became the second pillar, justice. Now, but how do you negotiate justice? Justice has to be accompanied with a share of resources and therefore development. This became a key component. However, it is not just development as an ideology. It's a development related to people, real people. You see, it is easier to defend institutions ideologically, but it is something else, and that is needed to defend the people, to be engaging in securing, and this is the third pillar, human rights. But even this pillar, human rights, you could divide it into 3 pillars, meaning the first one would be individual liberty. People ought to enjoy self-determination, autonomy, freedom, basically. Second, in order to have freedoms, you have to have this essential component, which is equality, which is extremely difficult, which is found almost nowhere in a complete manner. So that third pillar of human rights could be divided, I was saying, into 3. The first one, individual liberty. The second one, equality. And then the third one, life in dignity, the concept of dignity. So in other words, here is what I have just shared with you, just briefly. The 3 pillars are peace and security, justice and development, and human rights in terms of individual liberty, personal equality, and human dignity. These basically values sustain the whole edifice of the United Nations. All right? Now, then the concept of individual liberty, you could go a little further to expanded to include three kinds of freedom, basically. First one is freedom from want. Now you can see the idea of poverty, and because people ought to have enough to live decently. So freedom ought to be freedom from want. And then second, freedom from fear. Now imagine when there's war. As we speak, let me just think about the Copts in Egypt. A community, millions living in fear because anything can happen to them anytime. Right? So freedom from fear became important in the parlance of the UN, in particular when we talk about human rights. Then you have freedom from fear, from want, from fear, and then finally freedom to live in dignity, being respected, being valued, counting not as just someone that can be discarded or used as an object. And here, if I may just remind you, one of the probably core idea in Immanuel Kant's philosophy as far as the foundations for moral, when he said that a human being should never be used as a means to an end. It is a very important concept. Anyway, you can see that violations of any of these pillars, whether peace and security, justice and development, or human rights in terms of individual liberty, personal equality, and life in dignity, disrupt, in fact, the concept that I come back to again, the idea of dignity, and erode further the chances for social, peaceful coexistence and cohesion. Let me just use a footnote here to really congratulate you. I'm thinking about the Academia Europea de Yuste for what you're doing, because it is beyond just a learning environment. It is the building of humanity. I think it really goes further. And what kind of humanity? People who become humane in a world of violence, in a world of conflicts, in a world of division. So you really have my, respect, deep respect and congratulations. So any violation of any of these pillars becomes disruptive and prevent a peaceful coexistence. And I noticed that in the title. Now, violations of human rights have really one common denominator: the ignorance, negligence, or refusal to accept and affirm the dignity of every person. And I can even say the humanity of each person. It seems so simple, but wherever you go in the world, when people's humanity is accepted, then that is conducive to peace. But when that foundational value of accepting the humanity of the other person is missing, then you will see people being discarded, fighting, their dignity trampled, and then that, of course, disrupt any possibility to live together. Now, I mentioned the three pillars of the UN, and this part, just for the sake of not taking too much time on describing the system, I would like to just take just a few minutes briefly to talk about the middle pillar. And then, as you know, as I mentioned earlier, I will talk about the third pillar later, and especially focusing on religious freedom. But the second pillar is really important: justice and development. In about the year 1999, the nations decided to set a significant amount of money in order to achieve what they called by then the Millennium Development Goals. And you had basically 8 Millennium Development Goals. So again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, and these are something you could read, online anywhere, so there's no point to spend too much time. But they are, basically, these were, initially, you had 8 Millennium Development Goals. The first one being eradicating, now I'm talking about the second pillar, justice and development, right? So just I'm making sure that, I'm very dysfunctional because I taught in university for a while, so I tend to just repeat, being redundant, making sure that I'm with you and you with me, okay. So anyway, the first one then is eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. Second Millennium Development Goal, MDGs, they call them, achieve universal primary education. When you think about it, millions of children do not have access to school today as we speak. Promote gender equality and empower women. Extremely important. In some countries, tremendous progress. There's some ways to go. But in other countries, it's terrible what is happening to women in particular. There's no need to go, talk about what Daesh, ISIL, ISIS, and so forth doing in terms of slavery and so forth. Anyway, then reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. Goal number 7, ensure environmental sustainability. Now, this is today. And when we think about Pope Francis, the encyclical and how he, really took this and lead basically the world into a new phase, a new vision of our environment, I think that is remarkable. And then to develop a global partnership for development. Then, these goals, of course, were accompanied by targets. And again, I could spend time in this, with this, but there's no point except to say, just zooming on goal number 1, eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. The target was, very specifically, to divide into half between 1990 and 2015. This is the year in which we are. The proportion of people whose income is less than $1 a day. So when we talk about Millennium Development Goal, there were targets. And again, this in itself could be a lecture in itself, looking into, okay, where are we? See? Now, again, and what is really beneath these targets is, these are rights and human rights, and one of them is the right to adequate standard of living. Another one, right to work. Right to food. Right to education. Right to life. When we think about it, right to life. And of course, women's rights. Again, my apology having to go through this, but I think these are features you can Google anytime, so there's no point for you to come all the way for me to talk to you about this, right? So let me move on. Okay, right to health, of course, and then right to environmental health, we'll talk about. Now, let me move on further to say this. These goals that I just mentioned, the Millennium Development Goals, because we are in 2015, they have been revisited and expanded. Because yes, a lot of good have been done, and truly, nations really united to achieve a lot. Certainly, there are less poor people, but still too many. Right? So in other words, on the one hand, success, but on the other hand, tremendous challenges are still before the international community. So today, the UN focuses on what is called now SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Now, there are 17 of them. Again, these are basically a revamping. They revisit those Millennium Development Goals, expanding them, and of course, that means reflecting in a deeper way on how these goals should be fine-tuned a little bit, So again, just briefly maybe, ending poverty in all its form everywhere. See, it's not just extreme poverty and hunger, but expanded to ending poverty in all its form everywhere. End hunger, achieve food security, etc., ensure health lives, and so forth. And I could continue. Achieve goal 5, achieve gender equality, empower women and girls. Now, notice this is a new dimension added to it because, again, in many areas, girls have no right whatsoever, you know. So this language helps a little further. Now, of course, reduce inequality. I'm thinking about goal number 10. Within and among countries, make cities and human settlements inclusive. Inclusive. Now, again, this was not in the Millennium Development Goals. Now, we're thinking about cities inclusive. Why? Because of the issue of discrimination. In particular, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Of course, this is why they talk about Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, ensure sustainable consumption, production pattern, and so forth. Climate change. And then goal number 15 to protect ecosystems and so forth. Finally, I'm just mentioning 16 because this is important and I think is connected also to what is being done in this institution here. Promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Goal number 16 is really quite important. And of course, in a larger manner, strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. Now, notice this is connected to the United Nations, and the United Nations is composed of state actors, you know, nations signing the covenants, treaties, and so forth, you know, state actors gathering to make this world a better place. Basically, again, as I was saying at the beginning, instead of waging wars, fighting, trying to eliminate one another, why not live together, build a peaceful, right, environment for all nations to prosper? That's basically the foundational ideas. Now, something is sure, though, it is impossible that state actors alone to fulfill these, both the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is where I now move to my second section, meaning the existence and work and contributions of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Non-governmental organizations all over the world monitor the implementations of various projects and the goals, the UN-sponsored programs, etc. Moreover, their contribution, I'm talking about now the contributions of NGOs, create a climate conducive to more transparency. Yeah? Now, in a perfect world, you would expect that every government, right, is there for the interest of its people, right? In a perfect world. But that world doesn't exist yet. So we have to put some words of hope there maybe, right? But so, in other words, governments also should be accountable, of course, to its people. But its people ought to also have inner mechanisms that could help the process of government accountability. That is why you have non-governmental organizations or agencies monitoring, seeing to it that the governments are really fulfilling their commitments also, right? So their work brings state agencies to more accountability. Now, then we have to ask our question, what is in fact an NGO? What is it? According to the World Bank, and I thought this would be a safe place to find a definition, so we could quote several people, and, any definition can be contested. I was fascinated by the previous lecture, that the word work, so I was listening carefully, so anyway, interesting. But according to World Bank, an NGO is a private organization that pursues activities to relieve suffering, promote the interests of the poor, protect the environment, provide basic social services, or undertake community development. Now, a distinction is often made between operational NGOs and advocacy NGOs. Obviously, some integrate both dimensions, right? Let me quote here Andrew Haywood, who said, operational NGOs are ones whose primary purpose is the design and implementation of development-related project. Now you think about the second pillar, justice and development and so forth. And then they may be either relief-oriented or development-oriented. And may be community-based, national or international. Advocacy NGO exists to promote or defend a particular cause. And as I will mention a little later, the organization that I am a member is more of an advocacy NGO, but it doesn't mean that there are not some operations in specific areas. Now, in the context of the United Nations, the defining moment of NGOs occurred in the 1990s. Think about it, by the year 2000, over 1,000 groups had been granted consultative status by the ECOSOC. The total number of international NGOs far exceeds 30,000. Now you wonder, what are they doing? 30,000 NGOs, And recently I was made aware that in the area of human rights, and in particular freedom of religion and so forth, you have over 800 NGOs, around the world, interestingly. Now, of course, some of these NGOs have gained real fame and notoriety. Among them, one can mention the following, and I chose just three just as a sample here. Greenpeace. Greenpeace, if you notice, has a membership of 2.5 million and a staff of over 1,200. Of course, Amnesty International. I could mention Doctors Without Borders, or CARE International, remarkable work, which is dedicated, by the way, to the worldwide reduction of poverty. Now, maybe as a signal of their importance, it is estimated that 15% of international aid has been delivered by operational NGOs. Now, this is significant. It is significant when, of course, state agencies, when there is a problem somewhere, they flood in money and resources, which is good. But NGO really provide certainly their part in the equation. Now, maybe though, to provide a complete picture, we should mention the controversy surrounding the work of NGOs. We are in an academic setting, meaning we observe data, we look at things critically, not just, naively endorsing or promoting something without asking some key questions. Of course, Andrew Haywood provides us, I wanted to mention, with a summary of the issue. He says, supporters, you have supporters and critics. Supporters of NGOs argue that they benefit and enrich world politics. Why? Because they counterbalance corporate power, challenging the influence of transnational corporations, for example, right? They democratize global politics by articulating the interests of the people and groups who have been disempowered by the globalization process. Basically, this is to say that NGOs are the voice of interest groups, or some people groups, I should say. But also, they act as a moral force to a certain degree, widening people's sense of civic responsibility, and even create what some people will term global citizenship. In this respect, of course, we can find an emergent global civil society. But on the other hand, critics argue that NGOs are self-appointed groups that have no genuine democratic credentials. One has to admit that in some cases it's true. Someone can just, have a strong personality deciding, okay, I'm going to champion this cause and have some followers, etc., without submitting to the evaluation of the global community. Maybe. Also, in an attempt to gain high media profile and attract support and funding, NGOs have been accused of exaggerated claims, thereby distorting public perception and the policy agenda. Maybe so true. However, this doesn't diminish, I think personally, and I'm sharing my personal opinion here, the importance of NGOs in particular and what they do. So unquestionably, I can say the international community has come to consider as indispensable the contribution of NGOs. Now, in this context, I'm going to move to my third section because I am part of an NGO. So therefore, let me focus let me focus a little bit on the International Religious Liberty Association, to which I am a member. It was chartered in 1893, and I can say that its existence is justified today even more than ever before. And the reason why I am saying this is the following. Religious freedom is under threat today. Why is that so? I'm coming to that shortly. But the IRLA is the world's oldest religious freedom advocacy organization. It promotes freedom of belief for all people, regardless of faith. It has a non-governmental organization status at the United Nations, accredited by ECOSOC in particular. Along with the annual meetings of experts, and I'm not going to go into detail here, but later if you have some questions, I could come back to that. The IRLA sponsors regional religious freedom festivals, forums, and every 5 years organizes a World Congress which attracts an international mix of scholars, legal practitioners, government officials, and human rights advocates. Now the question, why focus on religious freedom? Why not something else? Today, the debate about religious liberty in the United States in particular is dominated by perceptions related to cases like that of Kim Davis. I don't know if you have heard about the county clerk who refused to issue licenses to same-sex couples. And because of this, the conversation about religious freedom has narrowed and has been co-opted by political agendas in the US. In the media also, religious liberty is described as the right not to participate in any form of same-sex marriages or the right to not pay insurance that would cover any part of the process of abortion or contraception. But there is more to religious liberty than meets the eye. And the reason why I am saying this, religious freedom is a part of a cluster of freedoms. In the human rights community, in particular at the UN, it is an accepted fact that all, and this is really an important feature, all human rights are, and they say, interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. All human rights, interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. Actually, the immediate consequence of this is that I cannot just say, oh, this is my area of focus, I don't care about other rights. that would defeat the very cause that I'm defending. Why? Because the rights are, again, interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. The same can be said about all the freedoms. They are interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. For example, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of choice, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly are all connected. Yeah? Now, allow me just to focus, and because of my particular area of work, on freedom of religion. There is a wide recognition of this freedom, no question. Just briefly, freedom of religion is explicitly recognized in international law through the UN Charter, obviously, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Helsinki Accords, the Declaration on all the elimination the Declaration on the elimination of all forms of intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief, the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. And I mentioned earlier the pillars that are, all the three pillars I mentioned, peace and security, justice, development, and human rights, they are all connected to the idea of freedom. And this sustains the whole pillars of the system, whether we talk about peace and so forth. Now, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Heiner Bielefeld, actually as we speak right now, he's giving a presentation in New York yesterday and today. But he said this: an urgent need exists for more conceptual clarity concerning freedom of religion or belief, not only in order to defend this right against inimical attacks from outside, but also to strengthen the consensus about the significance of freedom of religion or belief within the human rights community itself. Now, notice he's talking about conceptual clarity. This is the problem that is now current in the US. There are misperception and a narrowing, actually, of the understanding of what religious freedom is. Actually, let me just give a general definition maybe to begin with. Religious freedom is the right to profess, practice, propagate one's faith, or lack of faith, by the way. It is the right to pass it on to one's children or to people entrusted to one's care. It is the right to wear symbols and to display them in the public space. It is the right to build institutions as an expression of your belief, which are designed to promote one's convictions, worldview, and values. Now, I thought, given the time that is allocated for this presentation, to share a few theses about religious freedom. And I thought this could be helpful. Now, I am not pretending to give you 95 theses for the Reformation and all those things, no. But just more modestly to say the following. 1, freedom of religion or belief is recognized as one of the fundamental freedoms. It's a historical fact. 2, it is a universal human right accepted and ratified as such by the international community. In other words, it is part of the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 18 is very explicit. And nations signed this. So that means that they are accountable to really promote, to protect. Notice, I have not said, and I'm very careful with that, the government is not doing a favor to people by giving them freedom. No. This is an intrinsic right that they are to protect. It is different. It is not a favor they are giving, in other words. 3rd, this is considered the first freedom in the context of some democratic institutions. Now, the US, but before the US, when you are in America, sometimes people say, oh, well, we are the inventor of, no, you know. It was very, very interesting. This week I was in London, and we had one of the curator there giving us a very special tour, giving us access to some manuscripts and so forth, so on. Anyway, in the process, we saw the Magna Carta also. It was, a fascinating experience. I was at a meeting that is called the Conference of Secretaries of the Christian World Communions, leaders of major Christian communions, Catholics, Orthodox, Evangelical, Methodist, and you name it, etc. Because meaning Christians, communions are talking to one another in order to have a better coexistence and understanding of other denominations. As I was listening to your presentation earlier, I say, well, I wish I had time to also maybe just, share your presentation there, but then I say, no, I'm not invited for that, and you resist. Anyway, but no, that was fascinating. Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, number 4, freedom of religion or belief is central to all other freedoms. In fact, without freedom of religion or belief, no other freedom can flourish. And this is really easy to understand because freedom of religion is connected to freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, of expression. If I'm deprived of that freedom, then I'm deprived of the others also, to a certain degree. And I mentioned it is a primordial freedom undergirding the other freedom. In essence, it is the precondition for the relevance of other freedoms. Somebody said the following, and I'm quoting, religious freedom is the sine qua non of living freely. You may allow me to vote, own property, and associate freely in the public square in every other way. But if you do not permit me to speak and to act on those beliefs about ultimate reality that define who I am and why I am on this earth, then the other freedoms mean little. I am in a very real sense, then, all human freedoms depend on freedom of religion. As such, religious freedom is a prerequisite for and the guardian of all other freedoms. This is said by Thomas Farr in particular. Now, number 6, it is a compound freedom. I mentioned that. It includes other freedom, so no need to expand too much on this. Freedom of religion or belief is the expression of what it means to be a human person. It consolidates the fact that every human being is endowed with the ability to think, to make decisions and choices according to the intimate convictions of one's own conscience. And as such, you take this away, it is as if you're taking my humanity away from me. That's why it is that important. It is, of course, a legal right enshrined in most constitutions, interestingly, including the constitution of the country in which we are, Spain and Portugal, and etc. Actually, one of the things that I do when I'm invited, I think we were together in Brazil, yes. Right? And when speaking at the not the parliament, the legal, yeah. But one of the things I did was basically to start studying the Constitution, because I knew that there I would find enough material to be able to engage people about the importance of religious freedom. It is a political right, civil, and a cultural right also. It is a civic responsibility. Now, I can say freedom of religion now, and allow me to mention this in this context. It is important. It is also a spiritual endowment in the sense that it is a gift of God. In the Christian traditions, for example, freedom of religion, or actually all freedoms, are presuppose are grounded on the fact, this assumption, that humans are created in the image of God, and that human dignity finds its justification in that very reality, that humans are important, meaning humans have been created in the image of God, meaning humans are sacred. Now, of course, people usually respect more cathedrals, temples, synagogues, shrines, churches, and so forth. But the human person is actually called a temple in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and therefore more important than mere buildings that are made with human hands. But humans, in that perspective, are made in the image of God. Interestingly, even in the Muslim tradition also, in the Quran, very clearly it is stated that God endowed humans dignity. And if you look at the Asian religions, Hinduism, for example, human beings have what they call a soul, Atman, like in the Mahatma Gandhi, Atman, Ma, the great soul, basically. But what is of interest, according to Hindu worldview, the Atman, the soul, was connected with divinity, Brahman. And interestingly, when Hindu even culturally greet you and, they will say, Namaste, and put their hands together, Namaste. But literally it means from your grace, because they are acknowledging the divine dimension that is in the human person. All these to say that religions recognize the importance of human dignity. Now, it doesn't mean that religious people follow their own traditions, and start respecting other people. But at least in the text, you find, whether in Christianity, Catholicism, dignitatis humanis, for example, whether in the Orthodox tradition, or move to Islam, or move to Hinduism, and even Buddhism, even though there the sense of self is construed differently, still all these religions affirm human dignity. Now, and of course, it is not by chance that at the UN in particular, that this is like a rallying point. Interestingly, we met with the UN Secretary General in April, and discussing the issue of the Alliance of Civilizations. It was very, very interesting to notice the focus that he had on this idea of dignity. In fact, the Sustainable Development Goals post-2015 agenda is actually called the road to dignity. Mm-hmm. And this is the rallying idea or concept that he uses. Let me move on to say this, why it is a spiritual endowment, and that is because the most important, and now of course I'm speaking out of my personal Judeo-Christian conviction, that is freedom is a gift. Why is it a gift? Without freedom, no covenant is possible. In other words, love cannot be forced. We cannot tell any person, oh, you have to love me. No, because it has to be a choice, a decision. And that implies the freedom to choose precisely, and therefore freedom of thought, etc., etc. Let me mention, now this is very interesting. I noticed the first speaker mentioned that he started with his first line and not yet on his second. So I am just still at my introduction, All right. Anyway, religious freedom is really a core value. Let me say this. Religious freedom ultimately secures for everyone the right to be a human being, a person, endowed with the ability to think, to decide, to choose, to join, to change, to share, to invite others, including the right to transmit to your children your beliefs or values. Of course, they will choose later and will have those same prerogatives. So, for me, to promote religious freedom is really a way to contribute to a better humanity. That is what is at stake, the construction of a humanity free to choose, free to self-determine, free to live with others, free to respect and value what is sacred in others. So without the precondition of freedom of religion or belief, the act of consenting to a relationship, the distinctive human prerogatives of willingly sealing a covenant, as I was mentioning, is not possible. As I was mentioning also, a relationship of love itself becomes impossible. So let me move on then to the conclusion to say this. Religious freedom is in fact a factor of social cohesion, a contributor to a harmonious coexistence of various religious and non-religious individuals and groups. It contributes to social stability. It is proven that where there is hostility towards religious groups, there will be instability and, of course, minorities and so forth, and violence and warfare. So freedom of religion can then function as a moral center in international relations. So it is necessary for international peace, national peace, international peace, because without religious freedom, the other pillars, peace and security, justice, or other human rights, they cannot flourish either. So then, I can just move to let me just move to say this: freedom of religion or belief limits the power of the state and government of a people. It is an antidote to totalitarian regimes, to absolute monarchy. It provides a platform against abuses against minority and against a majority, where a minority group assumes the leadership of a country. You know, this happened. So international organizations then have recognized the pivotal position of religious freedom or freedom of religion or belief. Again, I will end by saying this: religious freedom contributes to what it means to be human. It is grounded on human dignity, motivated by the love, I can even say. So, for me, to promote religious freedom is a way of participating in what makes humans human. Thank you.